Hello and welcome to all of you joining us on the World Wide Web. My name is Lee Gowan. I'm the Program Director for Creative Writing at the School of Continuing Studies, University of Toronto. And I'm very pleased to be hosting a fascinating webinar discussion today called My Long and Winding Road to Publishing Success, which features our guest here, Terry Fallis, award-winning author Terry Fallis. Today's session is part of our Realize Your Dreams webinar series, and we'll be taking an inside look at the trials and tribulations of all the way from facing the terrifying thought of facing the blank page to actually seeing your book with your name on the spine, which Terry's going to tell us his story of that journey. Terry is, besides being the popular instructor of our writing Humour course, is you shall see a great storyteller. First, I'll tell you a little bit about Terry. Despite an engineering degree, Terry Fallis has enjoyed a successful career, first in politics and then in public relations and social media consulting. In 2008, his novel, The Best Laid Plans, won the Stephen Leacock Medal for Humour, the first self-published novel ever honored with this venerable literary award. And within a week, Terry had signed a publishing deal with McClellan and Stewart. In 2011, The Best Laid Plans was, am I stealing all your thunder that you're going to tell us? Yeah.
Most of it.
Well, why don't I just tell them about your next novel, the sequel, The High Road, was a finalist for the Leacock Medal in 2011. And since then, you've published 3 more novels, Up and Down, No Relation, and very recently, Poles Apart came out, your 5th novel. So you are prolific, Terry. So welcome, and it's great to have you here today.
Thank you, Lee. Happy to be here. This is great. And I say hello to all those watching out there, the thousands, the millions. All the members of my family.
From all over the world.
Yeah, exactly.
I just thought I'd start us out, Terry, by asking about that engineering degree, because it really intrigued me. How did you go from, and I don't think this is such an unusual thing, but how did you go from the engineering degree to deciding you wanted to write a novel?
Well, growing up, I was always interested in how things worked and building things. And by the time I was in grade 8, I had designed and built 3 full-sized hang gliders, none of which actually worked, which is probably a blessing, maybe why I'm sitting here today, because they didn't work. Then when I was 15, I designed and built a full-sized hovercraft and with a classmate. And so engineering seemed like the logical place for me to plant myself in the post-secondary world. But I think I knew probably by the time I was in 3rd year of engineering that my interest in politics had overtaken engineering, though I was still fascinated by it. And so I finished the degree, because when you've done 3 years in engineering, you're bloody well going to finish it, which I did, and have never had a moment's regret having an engineering degree, yet never having practiced, because I think it has actually shaped how I do almost everything in life, how I approach my day job, how I approach my writing. And so it's been a useful degree to have. So it went from politics into communications and public affairs consulting, and writing has been a constant throughout that. And so I decided to try and write creatively. So it may seem like a bit of a jump cut from engineering to writing, but there's a few stops along the way that make it more of a logical transition.
I suppose there was probably always, there usually is a dream of writing in the background.
Yeah, it emerged later in life, actually. It probably wasn't until I was in my late 20s, early 30s, where the notion of writing a novel began to come into focus. And still, it took me until I was 45, until I finally put finger to keyboard. So it took a while.
And that's the story you're going to tell us, is that
that's going to be covered in that. Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So
we'll proceed.
We'll leap into it. All right.
Yeah.
So I've just got this talk with a bunch of slides that sort of give some shape to this journey. It has been quite a long journey. I am a bit of a serial procrastinator. You can see this is my actual notebook where I would note my New Year's resolutions, and it took a long time for me finally to get my act together to write the novel, or to try to write it. It wasn't even to write it, it was to see whether I could. And if you're a procrastinator on these sorts of things, you should try and get over that and get onto it. And that might involve taking a course here at the School of Continuing Studies.
Good advice.
Good advice, because sometimes that's what can kickstart your interest and get you working on that manuscript. So when I finally decided I would try and write a novel, the first question was, what would I write about? And I thought, you know, if I'm going to be published one day, I'd want to be this international blockbuster best-selling novelist. So I should pick a topic that unites people wherever they may live, that wasn't too parochial or provincial. So I thought about questions of love or war, or that eternal struggle between good and evil, or the meaning of life, all of those things. And then I thought, wait, there is something that unites even more people than those big questions. And Lee, I'm sure you feel this way also. There's something that makes people around the world sit up and take notice. They're fascinated by it, and that's Canadian politics.
Of course.
Naturally. The fact that I decided to write my first novel about Canadian politics ought to be the clearest evidence that I never really had any expectation of being published. I just thought I ought to write about something that I know about. And having worked in that world and having developed some views on politics, it seemed like a good topic for me. And there wasn't much on the bookshelves, on the fiction shelves, about Canadian politics. I think probably for good reason, but I didn't know that then. I also decided I wanted to write a funny novel because that's what I like to read. I think it's sort of good advice to writers when they're starting out. And as far as I'm concerned, as I continue, I follow this advice to write what you would want to read. It makes it easier for you to judge what you have written. Probably makes it easier for you to find your voice if you're writing something that you want to read. So that's what I did. I wrote this manuscript from the write what you know school of writing. I've been in politics. I knew how that world worked.
Did you write it on that Underwood?
I did not write it on that Underwood, no. I found that somewhere. I do have an old typewriter like that sits there mainly symbolically in our library. I don't think the keys actually work, but it's nice to look at. So I spent about a year writing this manuscript. January 2006, I had a manuscript. I didn't really know whether I had written a novel. I just had this faint inkling that it was finished. I really didn't know whether the story held together, whether the characters were believable, whether it was funny. Just felt like it was done.
And there is that satisfying feeling of that stack of pages on your desk.
Yes, that 400 pages. And I'd never written anything of any length before, so it really was a new experience for me. So it's hard to know when you're finished, and it's almost as much intuition as it is sound practical judgment. Mm-hmm. And when I finished, I did what most writers do. I sent out dozens and dozens and dozens of query letters and plot synopses and sample chapters. And you've been there, Lee, I think. Mm-hmm. I know you have. And others who are listening have probably done this as well. And in my wildest dreams, I then sat back and I waited for the feeding frenzy to ensue over my debut novel.
And it happened immediately.
Oh, it just happened overnight. No, I waited, I diligently followed up. And after 12 months of doing that, do you know how many rejection letters I had received?
How many?
0. Mm-hmm. I had not received a single rejection letter. I had not made a big enough impression on the traditional publishing establishment to generate an automated rejection letter.
They didn't even get back in touch with you?
No. So, and I was not even that surprised because I had nothing to compare it to. And I had some friends in that world who said, satirical novel of Canadian politics, good luck with that. So after a year of doing that, I made two decisions. I decided I would try and build an audience for this novel on my own, and that I would go ahead and I would self-publish it to justify all the hours that I had spent in, clacking away on my laptop. So I signed up with a company called iUniverse and uploaded my manuscript and started going through the editing process and doing the cover design, all those things one does. But how to build an audience, I wasn't sure what to do. And I was already a podcaster at the time. I had a podcast called Inside PR, a weekly show about my day job in the public affairs, public relations world. So I decided just on a whim that I would podcast the entire novel, chapter by chapter, give it away for free on iTunes and on my blog. And what I didn't know at the time is that nobody in Canada had ever given away a novel, an audio novel, for free on iTunes. I'd gotten the idea from a writer in New York, Scott Sigler, who's sort of a horror writer and now a best-selling author. And I thought, well, why don't I try that in Canada? So I did that. And I would upload a chapter each week and wait and see what would happen. It was sort of a grand experiment in the emerging world of social media. And I was struck by emails I started receiving. And it seems that people in other parts of the world seem to find interest in this novel about Canadian politics. I was not convinced I'd find anyone in Canada with some interest in it. So it was a shock to get emails from every corner of the world. So it was really the comments I got back from podcast listeners that gave me the resolve to go ahead and self-publish the novel. Without the comments from listeners who were not related to me, I don't know whether I would have gone ahead and pushed the big red button to self-publish the novel. So
that gave you some validation to go ahead and put it out there in print.
And these are people, as I say, who weren't members of my own family, because I didn't really believe when my brother or my wife or my cousin said they enjoyed the novel, thought it was great, because I didn't know whether they'd give me the straight goods on that, because they loved me, presumably. So it was comments from people in India and Australia and England and Germany and parts of Africa and Australia who emailed with great comments. The only negative comment I ever got were from people who were complaining about having to wait a week for the next chapter to be posted. So those are the kind of negative comments you don't mind getting. So I went ahead and I self-published it. And in September of 2007, this box of books arrived in my office. There were 10 copies. This was my author package. It's all print on demand. So these were the only 10 copies in existence. And I had them in a box in my office. And I started living the glamorous high life of the self-published novelist, which means that I ordered a box of books from the publisher, and another box of 48 arrived, and I put the box in my car. And in between client meetings, I would pull up in front of independent bookstores in and around Toronto, and I grabbed 5 copies, and I would walk in a bit sheepishly and approach the owner and say, I've written the satirical novel of Canadian politics. I think it's pretty good. Would you sell it on consignment in your store? And if there are other self-published writers in the audience, they may appreciate this. Invariably, this wave of pain and angst would wash across the proprietor's face. And they would look at the book and they would read the back cover copy. They'd look at a few pages.
They'd sigh.
Yeah. They would notice that there were page numbers on each page, just like a real book. Once in a while, they would notice on the front cover, I have a positive blurb, as most blurbs are, you hope. From,
yes. It's always good to have
a positive one. From Alan Rock, who was our former Justice Minister and UN Ambassador. And I'd worked with Alan in politics, and he's a lovely guy. And the bookstore owner would look at this blurb and sort of furrow his brow and say, does Alan Rock know about this? As if I would make up a quotation and assign it to some famous person. Anyway, when I could finally convince them that I worked in politics, I knew Alan, and the book was legit, they would say, well, let's start with 2. And we'd put 2 copies on the fiction shelf. And if I had time, I would often go back to the same bookstore the next day, after shift change in the bookstore. And I would just go up to the counter and I would say, yes, I'm looking for that great new political satire by Terry Fallis. Okay, no, I didn't do that. I would go in, though, and I would stand in front of the fiction shelf and I would look at my book there. And there on the shelf above me would be Robertson Davies novels, and below me would be W.O. Mitchell and Robertson Davies and Alice Munro and Paul Corrington and Lee Gowan. And I would see these books, and you were quite close to me, actually, F and G. And I would look at my book there with all of these writers I had followed and collected and read and revered. And it was a pretty overwhelming feeling to see my book on the shelves with the cover facing out, because that's how I put it there the day before. But if no one were in the store, I would often pull out my BlackBerry at the time and I would take a photograph of my book on the shelf. And it was a thrill. And if you scroll back through the archives of my blog to the fall of 2007, you'll see some of those shots of my book in various bookstores. And this was a real thrill. I remember I also got a phone call from around the same time, the fall of 2007, from the manager of the bookstore at McMaster University, where I had done my engineering degree and got caught up in university politics and had lots of contacts still there. And the manager called me up and said, I see you've written a novel. Why don't we order a bunch of copies and you can come and do a launch here in the bookstore? And I thought, well, that'd be great. This is what real authors get. And I arrived on the appointed day. You can see I wore a shirt and tie to my own book launch. I don't think any novelist in the history of literature has worn a suit and tie to a book launch of a novel, but I didn't really know what I was doing. But I got on campus. There were posters all over campus promoting the event, and I walked in and there was a massive display of my books in the store. Well, there were about a dozen of my books in the store, which that is a massive display for a self-published novelist. There was a signing table where they had placed 3 pens, as if I might exhaust the ink in one of the pens from signing all the books I was going to sell. I had 2 others, and it was a lovely event, very well organized. I was introduced, and I talked about my time at McMaster. I read a piece from the novel. I talked about the novel. Both people who came bought books, but I was thrilled. I was thrilled. You had a grand total of 2 people?
Yes. That's very normal.
In fact, in the slide that's on the screen, that person standing in the background, he wasn't one of the ones who came to the book launch.
Yeah, no.
He was just buying a laser printer cartridge, I think. But I was thrilled. I had my book launch, and I got back to my office the next day, and I thought, by this time I had exhausted the 48 books that I had ordered, and I still had this original author package with 10 copies of the novel. And I said, what am I going to do now with these? And I thought, well, give them to clients, give them to friends. And then I don't know what, a moment of false bravado or something, but I went to the website of the Stephen Leacock Medal for Humour. And you will know that most literary awards in this country or any other country don't accept self-published works for consideration. You can't send your self-published novel into the Gillers or the Governor General's Award. They're explicitly excluded from consideration. But I went to the criteria, the eligibility rules on the Leacock Medal. There was no such restriction. Clearly an oversight on their part.
Yes, clearly.
And I read a little further, and it said the publisher must send in a check for $100. And I was the publisher. I had a check in my wallet. They needed a headshot of the author. I had that on my computer as well. And then it finally said, you must send the jury 10 copies of the novel. And I know it sounds like I'm making this up for good storytelling, but this is the absolute truth. If they had required 11 copies, you would be discussing publishing with somebody else here today. Because I would not have had the gumption to order a single copy from the publisher who was in the US, I think. In fact, had they not been sitting in a cardboard box suitable for mailing, that could have thwarted the whole enterprise as well. But I seemed to have everything that I needed, and I packaged it up, I put it at the front desk with the right postage on it, went back to my office, worked on a client strategy memo for 45 minutes, and then got cold feet. I said, you can't send your self-published novel into one of the oldest literary awards in the country. Like, what are you thinking? And I rushed out to pull it back, and it had left literally 5 minutes earlier. And I would have caught it were it not for the temperamental elevators in our building. But it took me a long time to get to the first floor, and I literally saw the driver in the postal truck do a U-turn on Yonge Street and drive up north on Yonge, and it disappeared into the distance. And so I thought, well, I've done it. And you can follow on the Leacock website the entries as they come in each year. And I would check the website every, 20 minutes or so, just to see what was going on. And by December 15th, because the entries close on the 31st, there were only about a dozen books in the running. I thought, well, maybe I've hit a really lean year in humor writing. And then I checked again on December 31st and scrolled through 48 books. All of the mainstream publishers dumped theirs in at the 11th hour. And there was Douglas Copeland's new novel, The Gum Thief. There was Will Ferguson's novel, Spanish Fly. He'd won the Leacock Medal twice by that stage. He's since won it a third time. There was Arthur Black's new collection, another 3-time winner. I just looked at all these writers who were in there, and I thought, wow, that was fun while it lasted. And I made a mental list of who I thought would be shortlisted, not without me on the list, obviously. And I didn't give it another thought until March 27th, 2008.
Funny how you remember the exact date.
Well, it was approximately 12:23:45 in the afternoon. And I was in Montreal on business. I just done a presentation in a boardroom for a client. I had 2 more to do that day in the afternoon in the same boardroom. But I'd read in the airport lounge that the shortlist was to be unveiled that morning in Aurelia, the ancestral home of the Leacock Medal. And I went to the website. I went online, at least, Google News, to try and the shortlist to see how close my little 5-person shortlist was with the actual one. And there was one lonely little story from the Aurelia Packet and Times, and I opened up the story, and the headline was 2008 shortlist unveiled. And I didn't read the story because there was a photograph in the story, and our eyes tend to go to the photo first. And there was, the head of the jury and the head of the Leacock Associates standing in front of a board with the 5 authors' headshots and 5 book covers on it. This was the shortlist. And I started at the wrong end of the board. And there was the Copeland novel. I picked it. I was 1 for 1. There was the Spanish Fly Will Ferguson novel. I picked it. There was Scott Gardner's great satire, King John of Canada, which I loved. I picked him. I was 3 for 3, feeling pretty good about my prowess at selecting the finalists. I missed the 4th one. I didn't recognize the author. It was an Alberta writer. And then the last place I looked was the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. And I laid my eyes on my ugly mug and my book cover there. And seriously, I mean, no offense to anybody who's tuned in, who has a family member who has had a stroke. But I thought that I just had a stroke because I was paralyzed and I couldn't speak, which, I thought stroke was a reasonable diagnosis under the circumstances. Eventually, I must have regained my faculties because my colleague, who didn't know what I was doing, said, "Terry, what's wrong? You just went white." And I have no recollection of my response. She claims all I did was raise a limp finger and wave it in the general direction of the computer monitor. I have no memory of the presentations I gave that afternoon. Nobody complained, but my mind was elsewhere.
At that point, you probably felt that this was enough, that just being on the short list.
Oh, exactly. Well, that was more than enough. I was completely bowled over and shocked. I mean, we flew back to Toronto that night. I didn't really need the plane. And when I got there, there was a message waiting from the head of the jury saying I was shortlisted. And, there was coverage the next day. By the way, Lee, I think you're supposed to remind our listeners and viewers that they should join the conversation.
Okay. Yes, do please join the conversation by sending your questions to #LearnMore or to the email address scs.mediacontact@utoronto.ca. I have a question. Shall I throw one in right now?
Sure, why not?
Sure. There's a question here this is from Chantel, saying what is the best course at the School of Continuing Studies? I guess is what's the best creative writing course? And I guess, would that be your course, in your opinion?
And if that's the Chantel, I think it is. This is clearly a planted question because she was in the course.
Oh, okay.
If that is Chantel. There are lots of great courses. It is a huge and diverse program at the School of Continuing Studies with lots of great writers who are teaching it.
Yeah, and for people starting out, just since I'm the program director, maybe I'll take that one.
I think you would be in a good position to do that.
Our most popular course is Creative Writing Introduction. There's also Writing the Novel Introduction, Writing Short Fiction Introduction, Screenwriting Introduction. Those introductory courses, if you're getting started in any genre, would be a good place to start, or just the Creative Writing Introduction course.
And it immerses you in that world, not just with the instructor, but with your fellow students. And it's just a great and supportive environment, which is what you need when you are trying to get through your writing. You need that validation. I took in 1988 the introductory course. It was the only course I took because my job overtook my life and I couldn't really do it any longer. But I did that full course. I loved it. Wrote a couple of short stories that were not funny at all. They were very earnest, with really strong feminist themes, which is the theme in my new novel, Poles Apart. It has finally emerged. But I have very fond memories of that course, so I would certainly recommend that. And every time I've taught the course, the group, after the course has ended, most of the class has stuck together and created a writer's circle to support one another as they continue their writing, which I thought was a wonderful outcome for the course. So lots of great options there.
Here's one more from Emily Gale Aiken. Writing is no trouble. You just jot down ideas as they occur to you. The jotting is simplicity itself. It is the occurring which is difficult. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, that's a quotation from Stephen Leacock.
Yes.
It's a hilarious line, and is fewer truer words were ever spoken. I mean, those are very very true words. It is tough, and we can talk later on about the writing process I take to try and avoid the challenges to which Leacock refers in that great quotation. Mm-hmm. But thank you, Emily, for that question and for your tweets earlier. So should we go back to our regularly scheduled programming? Then we'll come back. So when I was shortlisted for the Leacock Medal, there was all sorts of media coverage. And for a PR guy whose job is to put his clients in the news, it was very strange to be in the news myself, and a very surreal experience. Within a week of being shortlisted, I somehow landed an agent, Beverly Slopin. I tried for 2 years to find an agent and couldn't find one, but Beverly Slopin took me on the strength of being shortlisted. And we are still together, have a great partnership. Had lunch with her last week, and she's a joy to hang out with and has done a great job for me. So I finally had an agent. And then a month passed, and my wife Nancy and I drove to Orillia for the announcement of the winner, the Leacock Luncheon. I got to meet Scott Gardner, one of the other finalists. First time I think I'd actually met another author, which was a great experience. I was so pleased to meet him, and his book is wonderful. And my agent, Beverly, very experienced as she is, had sat me down and said, "Terry, you are not going to win the Leacock Medal." And I said, "Beverly, I'm still in shock from being shortlisted. I'm under no illusion I'm going to win." And she said, "Good, I just want to make sure you're grounded." And we got to the event, and it was a lovely time. And at the appointed hour, which was approximately 12:46:21 in the afternoon, my name was announced as the winner. And I descended into some other kind of medical stupor. And I was just staring blankly at the back wall. And as the applause died down, my wife
had to push you off the chair.
Well, it sounds like I'm making this up. I'm not, but she kicked me under the table and whispered in a voice that was just loud enough for everybody in the room to hear, "You just won. You've got to go up there now." And I went to the podium. And I rambled for about 6.5 minutes from a couple of notes I had jotted down in the parking lot on a business card I had found in my jacket. I still carry that business card with those bullet points in my wallet, not as a prop to use in Author Talks, but as a constant reminder of my extraordinary good fortune, because my life as a writer changed in that instant. Mm-hmm. And I arrived feeling like kind of a weekend scribbler or writer wannabe, and I left feeling like maybe I was a novelist. And on the way home, my wife knew I was pretty well overwhelmed and said nothing for much of the journey home until we hit Barrie, I think it was. And she turned to me and said, "They'll write about this in your obituary." And I slowed down immediately. But that was the first words out of her mouth. And the next day I responded to all sorts of hundreds of emails. The podcast that I was still on iTunes, and still is to this day for that matter, went to #1 on the iTunes literature charts ahead of the New York Times Book Review podcast, which was a shocking development. Within a week of winning, we signed with McClellan and Stewart, and not just with M&S, but Doug Gibson became my editor. And Doug Gibson may not be well known to everyone on tuning in, but if there were a Mount Rushmore to Canadian publishing, I think Doug Gibson's face would be one of them, etched into the mountain. He was Robertson Davies' editor, W.O. Mitchell's editor, Hugh McLennan, Alistair MacLeod, Mavis Gallant, Morley Callahan. He is and always will be Alice Munro's editor. He went to Sweden. Is that where you pick up that little bauble she got last year?
Oh, yeah.
The Nobel.
Yes.
So I don't know why he's my editor, but he is, and he's the only editor I've ever had. He's still my editor today, and I was with him last night, actually. And he'll be getting the manuscript for my new novel when it's finished. And so what a joy to have him as my editor and publisher. So the self-published version went to the M&S version, which was released in September of 2008, and that is the novel that keeps on giving. I hit the road.
Did it change much from the self-published novel? No?
Very little.
Yeah.
There are 2 paragraphs missing from the original that we cut out, and the Scottish words like didna, couldna, and willna, because my protagonist is a Scot, are actually spelled correctly in the McClellan and Stewart version of the novel.
Well, Doug Gibson would have made sure of that.
Doug Gibson would have known that. He is a Scot from way back, went to St. Andrews University. Next up was the High Road, and I wrote that in the next year, and it did very well. I podcast it as well. But as I say, The Best Laid Plans wasn't done yet. For some miraculous reason, it made it from the top 40 to the top 10 to the top 5 in Canada Reads in 2011. And my stalwart champion was Ali Velshi, CNN's chief business correspondent at the time. And I think he could have argued and successfully brought the Toronto Telephone Directory to victory in Canada Reads. So passionate and articulate is he. But we knocked off all the other finalists, and The Best Laid Plans won Canada Reads, which is a blessing for any writer, particularly a rookie writer, because
it sells a lot of books.
As you know, it sells a lot of books, not so much because of the book itself, but because of that little white badge that gets stuck on the front cover, the Canada Reads winner badge.
And the program itself, and the people being riveted to the radios.
That's right. It sells more books in this country than anything else except for the Giller Prize. So, it had sold about 10,000 copies by the time Canada Reads rolled around, and now it's 120,000 copies or something. And that's because of that's the Canada Reads effect in action. And that was a great thrill, and that probably changed my life as a writer as much as the Leacock Medal, because it became a bestseller. And Up and Down came next, and it did very well. I was very happy with that. I love that book. Again, The Best Laid Plans then became a TV series with CBC, which was an incredibly surreal experience to sit down on the set and have lunch with characters that I've been carting around in my brain pan for the preceding 12 or 8 years or so.
I have a question actually about that.
Excellent.
So I'll stick that in. One of our listeners that asked, how did that CBC series happen? If you want to tell a little bit about that.
Well, my agent got a call from a production company, PDM Entertainment, and they had been meeting with CBC, and CBC had expressed some interest in the novel, and he came to me, read the novel, loved it. We had lunch. I liked their vision for the novel. Frankly, I probably would have said yes had I not liked their vision for the novel, but there wasn't anyone else lining up to bring my words to the small screen. So I said yes, and joined the production team in a very peripheral role. I was a story consultant, I think, and I was on the set. I reviewed the scripts, and it was just a terrific experience. And I love the show. I even got a cameo in the show. On the screen, you can see me shaking hands with the Prime Minister, who was played by that great Kids in the Hall actor who was also on Saturday Night Live. And he just did a great job. So it was fun. And if that's not enough, this past September, my wife and our 2 sons and I flew to Vancouver to watch the debut performance of the stage musical based on The Best Laid Plans, which I thought was amazing. don't feel you should.
Musical.
Yeah, exactly. Don't read the Globe and Mail review of it. I don't know what show she was watching at the time, but the other reviews were quite positive, and I loved it. And they're working hard to have it tour, and hope it'll come to Toronto and to Ottawa and some other Canadian cities. But it was a great show, and to sit there and watch it come to life on stage was very cool. So No Relation came next. Was thrilled that it miraculously won the Leacock Medal last year. I would have died happy winning the Leacock Medal once. I never dreamed it might happen twice. Poles Apart just came out about a month ago and seems to be doing well and having a lot of fun with it. So if you listen to this strange journey, you will understand how I feel, that maybe I have exhausted my lifetime allocation of good fortune. I'm very careful stepping off stages and descending stairs and crossing streets.
And there was also that ominous thing your wife said after winning.
Yes, that's right.
About your obituary.
The obituary, that's right. Exactly. So I've been waiting for the roller coaster ride to end. I hope it never does. But I remember when I was back as a self-published writer, feeling like I was sitting outside this well-defended castle where writers like you, who were published by big houses, are inside and we're sequestered outside, the self-publishing rabble trying to get in. I sort of feel like I've delivered a pizza in the side door of that castle and have taken off my fluorescent orange delivery vest and stayed. That's what it feels like. So anyway, that's the strange journey to the published land, and it's been a wild ride.
Thank you so much for that story. We are getting questions coming in.
After that long talk, there are questions.
Well, here's a comment. Terry, are you attempting to win a Stephen Leacock Award for humor on a YouTube video?
I don't think I'm eligible for that.
And you mentioned, I think you've already answered this question to some extent. Did you consider getting a publishing agent when you were self-publishing your book? You had sent to a few agents?
A few. I sent to everyone in the country, and most of them in the United States.
And you didn't get an answer from them?
Publishers, small houses, and literary agents, dozens and dozens and dozens of them. And I didn't get any response at all. I didn't get rejection letters that I could put up on my wall as at least some manifestation of the effort. Nothing. I got nothing. So
I guess people can take that as some sort of validation if they are getting, or if they're getting no response, or if they are getting even the rejection letters, that this novel that ended up being so successful got that kind of a response from agents and publishers.
I truly believe that the space that separates the unpublished from the published is very, very small and can be eliminated in a moment of serendipity, a chance meeting with somebody. So
here's a question. What helped you, besides a good manuscript, that other self-published writers might not have yet?
Thought of yet or done?
Yes, might not have done yet.
Well, I took it upon myself to try and build an audience for the novel.
So the podcast.
Right, and it was really, that was not so much to build an audience, but to get some feedback to see whether or not I had actually written a novel.
Right.
And that was very useful to me. And I learned a lot through that process. And people were very supportive, and that gave me confidence that I didn't really have, and a bit of validation that I couldn't get anywhere else other than from my family members, who were very supportive. There are lots of places now you can post your work and have it looked at. Wattpad is one. There are Smashwords is another, I think, where you can go.
Yeah, you were sort of at the forefront of
it was before those sites came out.
And now it's much more common to be putting your work out there in that way.
And I'm often asked, why would you give the audio version of your novel away for free? And it's, the theory there is that if you give it away for free in one format, in my case, the audio format, I would never have given it away for free in the written form. But as an audiobook, if people liked it, they would buy a copy of the book. And I'm convinced, and I think the anecdotal evidence bears this out, that we have sold more books because I've given away the audio version for free. And I have podcast all of my novels and given it away for free. Pulls Apart, I just posted the last chapter last week, I think it was. So my weekends are now
serially still.
Yeah, I still do one chapter each week because I don't have time to do it in any more concentrated time. I literally am podcasting it and then posting it in a day and a half apart, sort of. So I still do that, and I feel some loyalty to my podcast listeners who I think help get me started.
Okay, here's another one. Another question. How do I find a local publisher in Toronto? So I guess how do I find they're in Toronto, there's both big publishers and small publishers. There are lots of different publishers, and that's a question that I think many writers would like to know. It is a challenge because most publishing houses will tell you that they won't accept unsolicited manuscripts, that you have to work through an agent. So often a writer's first task is to find a literary agent. And without depressing people even further, I think it's probably harder to find a literary agent than it is to find a publisher. Yeah, and the large publishers, as you say, you have to have a literary agent.
You can't just send a manuscript into McClellan and Stewart or Random House, Penguin Random House. They won't take them. But you should look for an agent. I think it's good advice to try and find an agent who is new and trying to build their stable of writers. They are more likely to be open to considering manuscripts and new writers, because part of them is thinking, wow, this manuscript that just came in the mail, maybe this is the one. Maybe this is the one. Because at some point, Robertson Davies' manuscript was sitting in an envelope and someone was saying, maybe this is the one. So the finest books ever written at some point were an unknown manuscript sitting on top of a slush pile in an agent's or a publishing house. So I think you should pursue that.
The most important thing, though, is to make sure that manuscript is as solid as you can get it. And
absolutely. And, I sometimes...
Creative writing classes can help for that.
Right, exactly. Because if you send in a manuscript that is not quite right, in your rush to try and be published, if you have not done justice to the manuscript, that won't serve you well. It really won't. And I tell writers not even to... Don't worry about the published house. Who's going to publish this, and where will it sit on the sort of the range of literature? Don't think about that. If you're thinking about that, you're not thinking about your story and your sentences. And better to write the book you really want to write without even any reference to whether or not it's marketable or of interest to publishers, I think, because that will be your true work and written with authenticity that will be hard to capture if you decide to write about vampires because that's what's selling this year.
You're usually too late when you decide.
Yeah, that's right.
When you're behind.
That's right.
Here's another one which relates to what you've just said about working on those sentences. What was your process of editing before getting an actual editor?
Good point. And maybe I should step back and talk briefly about my writing process. I'm an engineer by training. So engineers don't build bridges without blueprints. I don't write novels without blueprints. I am a very heavy outliner. I plan and map and plot my story so that at the end of that process, I literally have a 60 or 70 page outline, 2 or 3 pages of bullet points, for each chapter. So I not only know the arc of the story, beginning, middle, and end, I know the arc of the story within each chapter. And one cannot get writer's block when you have 3 pages of bullet points for chapter 7 sitting on this side of your screen and your manuscript for chapter 7 on this side of your screen. And that's how I write. I cannot write the manuscript until I have eliminated every bit of uncertainty I might have about the story. So by the time I start writing the manuscript, I'm able to devote all of my questionable cerebral powers on crafting sentences. No part of my brain is worried about what's my character going to do after this paragraph, because it's all mapped out. I'm not suggesting everyone who's watching this that that's how you should write. I'm just telling you that that's how I should write. I think part of our job as writers is to figure out how we write best.
What works for you?
What is our method? What is
Because as you say, it is different for every
writer.
There
are so many writers who have written far better books than I will ever dream to write, who don't have any plan at all, who sit down and just start with this hazy idea and follow it through to the end. Richard Wright, who wrote Clara Callan, I went to hear him speak, and he said, I couldn't get my ass in the chair. Can I say ass on a webinar?
I think so.
I couldn't get my ass in the chair each morning if I knew where this story was going. So for him, it's the sense of discovery that keeps him coming back. For me, I'm on the other end of the spectrum. It's the sense of certainty that allows me to write quite quickly the 100,000 word manuscript that ends up being turned in.
So
the editing process.
So when you have that 100,000 word manuscript, yes. I mean, the problem that most of us have, that you never get over, is when you don't have anyone else to read it, right. How do you get some distance on it so that you can edit it? How do you get outside of your own head? Right.
It's kind of like that old adage, if you're a lawyer and you decide to defend yourself, you've got a fool as a client. Yes. I think something like that. Well, I edit chapter by chapter. I edit when I write a chapter, I go back and edit it and work it through a couple times. Then I set it aside, I move on to the next chapter, and I write that chapter, I edit that. And then when the whole thing is done, I go back and I edit the whole thing again. So I'm going through chapter by chapter several times, and then as a whole manuscript 2 or 3 times as well. And the first time I did it, I didn't know it. It didn't even occur to me. So naive was I. It didn't occur to me that I might have a freelance editor have a look at this manuscript. Mm-hmm. I didn't really know what I was doing. But I think it's very good advice, because the finest writers become even better when they are under the care and guidance of a skilled editor. Back. Yes, they push back. Yeah. So I think my writing is better for having Doug Gibson in my corner and
Did you have trusted readers at that point where you didn't have an editor?
No, I wouldn't say I did have trusted readers.
You did put them out there, the chapters out there on the podcast.
They could hear it, but the novel was written then. I was reading from the finished manuscript then. But my wife would read, my twin brother Tim would read, But
you didn't trust them?
Not fully. My sister-in-law Kathleen read it. I did have one freelance writer I sat on a board with who read it and really liked it. But, you know, I didn't know whether it was legitimate feedback or whether they were doing it because they were friends and family and people who liked me. So
right. I would add again, creative writing classes can be a good way to help along with the
definitely
classes.
Because I think some writers don't actually.
You are getting feedback.
So. Right. That's right. And in our course that I teach, we do workshopping every single night that we meet. And to get into that routine of listening to comments from others and taking them in a thoughtful and constructive way, thickening our skin a little bit, accepting the positive advice for what it is, but also thinking hard about areas that might be improved.
And the workshopping process is helpful in that not only are you learning through what you're hearing about your own work, you have to critically analyze other people's work. And sometimes it's a lot easier to see other people's mistakes than your own.
Very good point.
It always is easier to see other people's mistakes than your own.
I think professional development for a writer is reading. That's what we do. We don't really go to conferences or take training courses. We read. That's our professional development. And we can learn so much from learning how to read and learning how to integrate what we learn from close reading of a broad range of works into our own writing. So you're absolutely right. You can learn that all at the school, no question.
Here's some more questions. Did any of the agents and/or publishers that rejected your manuscript fess up afterwards with a memorable remark?
I don't think so. None who I've met, and many people have said, "Gee, you must have felt you go back and be pretty snide and cocky with that." Absolutely not. I was so happy to run into the warm embrace of McClellan and Stewart and Doug Gibson that there was not any part of me that wanted to chide anyone for overlooking it, because I still think it's a crapshoot whether someone who might connect with your work is going to read it in a publishing house or an agent's office. So believe me, I was more than grateful to greet McClellan and Stewart warmly. So I've never spoken to any agents who passed on it, but maybe one day I will.
When you receive comments from your editor about your drafts, how do you approach to making the changes? Do you end up rewriting most of the chapters sometimes, or?
Not in our process. What happens is when I finish 5 or 6 or 7 chapters of the novel, and Doug Gibson already knows the storyline because we've talked about it, I'll send him the first 6, 7 chapters and not sleep for a few days while he reads them, and then he will give me some thoughts. And sometimes it's not very dramatic at all. Sometimes it's, it feels a little thin in this area. We may need to think about a couple of more characters that might come into the play here. And I almost always accept his advice. And then I finish the manuscript and I give the whole thing to Doug. And there isn't a lot of editing from Doug, really. I've not had that experience where he has said, I don't like chapters 9 through 14. We should lose them, and we need to kill off this character. I haven't had that.
I don't like the mother. We'll kill her.
Right, exactly. Mm-hmm. So I've been very lucky, I think. He makes little comments. He sometimes will say, can we amp up this tension a little more here? Mm-hmm. I think the harshest comment I got from him was when he put a little curly bracket around 2 paragraphs and wrote in his pencil hand, "You're taxing the reader's attention here." And I cut out those paragraphs before I even finished reading his comment, because he was absolutely right. I was just listening to myself write in those paragraphs. But generally, and he attributes it to my methodical process, that by the time he gets my draft, he thinks it's the equivalent of a 3rd or 4th draft because of how meticulously it's been plotted and planned. So at that stage in the process, we're not cutting out pages, or I've never rewritten chapters. It's generally pretty close at that stage, for which I'm grateful. Because I know Doug probably won't be my editor forever, and I'm dreading the day when I get that call from whoever might be my editor, 20 years
So you're
ago.
obviously a skilled self-editor.
Well,
will you be teaching other courses at the University of Toronto?
Will I be teaching other courses? Good question. Because I still work in a day job most days, and writing and promoting the books, I kind of only have time to teach one course once, maybe twice in the year. Or I'm doing it again, aren't I?
Yes,
Starting
you're doing
January?
it in January.
January. Yes. Starting in January.
People can find it on the website.
They can. And
maybe there's even a link somewhere.
That's right.
In what you're looking at on the webinar, there may be a link.
There might be a link. If there isn't, it's not too hard to find. It's a humor writing course, and we have a lot of fun. We spend most of the class laughing, actually, because we've had very, very funny students in the class. We've had a great time. So I don't have plans to teach a different course, but I'm interested in teaching. So who knows? Maybe at some point that might happen.
Here's a question asking if you're writing another novel. You've just had another one out, Poles Apart, which people can pick up for Christmas gifts.
That's right. Our operators are standing by.
Have you already started a new one? And the other question they ask, I think I know the answer to. It says, are you self-publishing, or do you feel you're better equipped to get the traditional publishing route this time?
Yeah, I only self-published the once, and I have been very happily in the McClellan and Stewart stable ever since, and hope I am always there. I am writing a new novel right now. I'm in my planning stages, which is the longer portion of my writing process, is the mapping out and the outlining. So I'm doing that now. I'm again writing about things that I know about. I'm writing about identical twins.
Oh.
I'm an identical twin.
Oh, you are?
I've never written about identical twins before. The story doesn't mirror in any way.
So how do we know this is you?
Yeah,
and not
exactly.
your twin? Yeah.
I get that a lot, given how many talks I end up doing. But yes, I sometimes send Tim around to book signings, and no, I don't do that. But
that's why you've written so many books. That's why you're so prolific. You have 2 people doing it.
That's right. So I am writing the new one. It's coming. if we stay on the same schedule, I imagine it will be hitting bookstores in May of 2017.
Okay. We'll be watching for that. Here's a great question. When you were writing the book, did you have a day job, and how do you manage writing and the day job in terms of time management and motivation?
I do have a day job.
You still have a day job?
Yes, I would. 4 days a week I work now, so I can afford to be a novelist on the 5th day. I would like very much to be a full-time writer, but most writers in this country, even those who are moderately successful, have jobs. Lee, you have a job. You work at the school. It's very tough. The economics of being a novelist in Canada preclude all but the top 0.5% maybe of novelists to do that alone. You're in Margaret Atwood territory there.
And that other new Canadian novelist, John Irving.
John Irving, yes, who is now a Canadian novelist. That's right. He's one of my mentors. He doesn't know that he's one of my mentors, but he has been for many years. So I do have a day job. It's tough to balance. It is, but you need, I think, the twin pillars of discipline and desire. You need both to write a book, and it helps to have maybe a third pillar of craft, some ability to write sentences. But if you want to enough, I'm living proof of this, that you have time to write a novel. You do have time. If I have time, you have time to write a novel.
How much time do you put into writing?
It's when I'm in writing mode at the tail end of the process, when I'm writing the manuscript, I try and write a 5,000-word chapter every week until it's done. And that's usually a weekend endeavor, but sometimes if I don't get the chapter done, I will have to write in the evening sometimes. But I'm pretty fried from my day job at the end of the day that I find it hard to write. I'm not one of those writers who believes in that axiom, you must write every day. I don't write every day. I can't. My life.
You must write often enough to get all those.
I write often enough, but it's not every day.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I'll just try to. Here, this is a very specific question. I studied publishing in Ireland, and literary agents were not at all necessary. Am I right to assume this is a necessity in Canada and North America?
I don't think it's a necessity for smaller presses. Right. I mean, you can write to a smaller press, and some of them will even accept unsolicited manuscripts. But if you want to be published by Doubleday or Penguin or Random House or McClellan and Stewart or HarperCollins, they won't be accepting unsolicited manuscripts, to the best of my knowledge. You will need an agent to go there. But hope springs eternal.
Okay. Well, with that mention of hope, thank you so much, Terry, for being here. I'm going to wrap up our final webinar in our series this year. And thank you so much for joining us at the University of Toronto School of Continuing Studies.